This is the Berman Method podcast featuring Dr. Jake Berman and physician assistant Jenny Berman. We are here to treat problems and not symptoms. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not to treat anyone or to give medical advice. If you are interested in any information that we are giving and would like to use this for yourself, we recommend that you contact your primary care physician or reach out to us and ask us questions about yourself specifically. Enjoy!
And we're back, the Berman Method podcast, where we are focusing on treating problems and not symptoms. I haven't said that in a while, have I?
Oh, well, are you sure? You
Treating problems, not symptoms?
Yeah, you don't say it every time.
I used to, but I think there was a stretch where I forgot to say it.
Oh, I thought it was just habit, so you don't realize you're saying it, but you really did say it.
Oh, kind of like driving home and you don't really remember
the
last stretch of
autopilot. You're not sure if you stopped at the stoplight or not. Was that stoplight green or did I just go through it? That happens to me sometimes.
Well, who are we? Who are you? Who are these people talking right now?
Oh, I'm Jenny Berman, physician assistant, and my lovely husband. If you've listened to the past 30-something podcasts, that was funny.
Dr. Jake Berman here, and we are the originators of the Berman Method. That is essentially treating problems, not symptoms. We are David against Goliath, going against the corporate medical system, because we truly believe that 99% of the corporate medical system here in America is focused on treating symptoms and not the actual problem. So let's give you some blood pressure medication versus figuring out the reason why your blood pressure is elevated to begin with.
Right.
Let's give you some pain medication versus figuring out why it's hurting in the first place.
Correct.
Got it.
But that's not what we do.
No, we do the opposite. We figure out why is it hurting in the first place. We want to treat the problem, not the symptom.
Perfect. So today,
very controversial topic. I am so excited. I am jacked up right now. I'm just like floating, ready to attack.
You've been just brewing on this. What is it? Dun-dun-dun.
Dun, 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 dun. We're going to talk about stretching. Is stretching a good thing?
Well, yeah, it's good for us, isn't it?
Depends.
Interesting.
It depends. It really does depend. Stretching in general is not a good thing or a bad thing. It depends.
Certain times good, certain times not good.
Correct.
Great for some people, not so good for other people.
I'm gonna take that one with a grain of salt. More necessary for some people. I'll give them that.
Okay.
I don't know that I would necessarily say great. And I guess to come right out of the gate swinging, I want everybody to understand the why behind what I'm saying right here, where I don't necessarily think stretching is a good thing, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's very dependent on the situation. For example, the most simplistic way to look at things is we want to have an equal amount of strength and an equal amount of flexibility. Does that make sense?
Okay, good. Yes, strength equal mobility or flexibility.
Yeah, flexibility.
Okay.
So if we use the 0 out of 10 scale, meaning 0, you have no flexibility, you're stiff as a board, you can't do anything, and 10 out of 10 flexibility, you're like Gumby or like a yogi, you can put yourself in a pretzel and bend all sorts of different directions. Then we use the same exact scale for strength.
Mm-hmm.
So 0 out of 10, 0, you're weakling, paralysis essentially, versus 10 out of 10, you're a bodybuilder and you could lift insane amounts of weight.
Okay.
So if you have a 10 out of 10 flexibility, meaning you're super flexible, you better have a 10 out of 10 strength.
Right.
Because if you don't, now we have an imbalance. And imbalances is when injuries occur.
Right. So we talked about, maybe it was last week, or we talked about people who are hypermobile, meaning they move too much, their joints move too much, too flexible, creates issues with the knee, the hip. We talked about that. So that's kind of where we're going here, is we have to make sure that if we do have hypermobility or increased flexibility, that we have equal strength to support the joints. But is it, okay, so my brain's going. I didn't even have caffeine yet today. But if you are hypermobile.
I didn't know that this was a caffeine day for you.
What?
You don't drink caffeine every day.
No, I don't. I know. That's what I said. I haven't had caffeine yet today.
And
my mind is thinking.
Okay. You need caffeine to make your mind think?
Well, clearly not, because it's thinking. But, okay. So if you are hypermobile or have great...
Hold on. Let me interrupt you right there. Oh. Just so everybody listening understands what we're talking about, hypermobile. Hypermobile is 7, 8, 9, 10 on that scale. So 0 out of 10, you've got no flexibility. You're as stiff as a board. And I'm going to start considering you hypermobile once you get above a 7. So let's say 8, 9, 10. If you're an 8, 9, or 10 flexibility out of 10, you're hypermobile.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. So the joints move more.
Yeah.
So is it possible to be in that 8, 9, 10 flexibility range and be in 8, 9, 10 strength range? Is that possible?
Extremely challenging. Very, very possible.
Okay.
And the perfect example I can think of is there was this guy, it was a televised event. I don't know if it was on one of those shows, America's Got Talent, or one of those shows, but this was years ago when I saw this. It had to be at least 10 years ago, where there's this guy performing in Vegas, and you just look at this guy and you're like, damn. He's strong. Like, this guy is just ripped, jacked, shredded, ripped, nasty looking dude. And he was performing these super slow, I guess, acrobatics. I don't know if that's the right word to say it. Kind of, you know what it's similar to, since we just had the Olympics, when the male gymnasts are doing their floor routine and they go and they do all the jumping and twisting, but then they stop and they bend over and they go into one of those handstands super slow.
Yeah.
Like that's a 10 out of 10 flexibility and a 10 out of 10 strength.
As soon as I asked you that, I was like, well, I guess it's kind of like gymnast. Majority of gymnasts are very, very flexible.
Olympic gymnasts.
Okay, yes. High elite.
Because you're a gymnast.
And I used to be really, really flexible. But see, here's the problem. I used to be so flexible, but we were required to stretch 30, 45 minutes a day, every day, part of our practice. And then we did all our strength and lifting and gymnastics moves. Now, I don't stretch that much. I just lift all the time. So now I'm stronger and not nearly as flexible as I used to be. My hamstrings and my shoulders are still flexible.
It's so funny that you're saying this right now, because if I had to rate you on flexibility and strength, I would put you at equal. So you've got equal flexibility and equal strength, but your perception is you've got more strength than flexibility. So if I gave you numbers, I would give you a 9 out of 9 flexibility, 9 out of 9 strength.
9?
But if you had to rate yourself, what would you rate it at?
I would say a 7 flexibility and probably an 8 strength.
She's so humble.
But I think I'm slightly less flexible. The thing is, certain parts of my body are very flexible and mobile and other parts are not.
Okay, yep. Now we're going to start getting particular. I'm just saying in general.
Okay, so let's go. Where's this going as far as our perception of our flexibility?
I'll give you a perfect example. A yogi, right? So a yogi, my definition of a yogi is somebody that does yoga 17 times a day for 15 days a week. Just absolutely in love with yoga. Yoga is the end all be all, cures everything. I'm being sarcastic right now if you couldn't tell.
Because yoga is good.
Yoga is good.
We do like yoga.
I really do like yoga. Again, it has to be balanced though.
Right.
So for this example, without fail, at least every couple of months, somebody will come into the office for back pain. And it's usually a female who does yoga 38 times a day and can put herself into a pretzel and just does not understand why her back is hurting. Mm-hmm. She'll say straight up, I do yoga 38 times a day. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. She's like, well, every morning I just feel really tight. And in reference to her hamstrings. Mm-hmm. And I love this. It cracks me up every single time when I see this because I can see him walking through the door. I'm like, okay, this is definitely more flexible than strength on the scale. And she says, I feel tight. So I wake up and I do yoga first thing in the morning. I'm like, okay, that's great. So I say, bend over, touch your toes. And of course, she can bend over and put her chest on her thighs and essentially put her elbows on the ground. And I'm going, but you feel tight? So her perception is that she feels tight and she needs to stretch out. Does that make sense?
Right.
So that's the difference between perception versus reality.
Okay.
And
so you're going to tell us what's wrong with her back?
Sure. Yeah. Since we're already on this subject, since we're already going down this rabbit hole.
The anticipation's killing me. I want to know what's wrong with her back if she's so flexible.
So let me digress for a second. And I used to work with a really great manual therapist back in the day. And he's the one that actually gave me this idea. He's the one that said, when the body is in perfect strength all around, you should never need to stretch. Prior to him saying that, I stretched at least 3 times a week after I would work out. I would just spend 10 minutes, at least 10 minutes, if not 20 minutes, focusing on just stretching and loosening up. And he said, when you have perfect strength on all sides of every joint, you should never need to stretch. And I was like, what? Stretching's good for you. He's like, stretching is good if you're tight, but why are you tight to begin with? Mm-hmm. Usually you get tight because something else is weak. Mm-hmm. So that's your body's protective mechanism is to tighten the muscle to help give that joint stability. And when you perceive that consciously, that gives you the perception of tightness. So now fast forward or come back to this conversation with the yogi with back pain. When she feels, what's the number one cause of back pain? Everybody listening to this should know this right now.
Weak booty.
Weak ass syndrome. So weak glutes is the number one cause of back pain. I know there's various other different reasons. However, the most common cause of back pain is weak glutes. So when I'm looking at this yogi and she's telling me that she perceives this tightness in her hamstrings, yet she can bend over and put her elbows on the ground, because her glutes are so weak, her hamstrings are hyperactive, trying to compensate for the weakness in her glutes because she has so much flexibility compared to her strength. She's a 10 out of 10 flexible, but a 4 or 5 at best out of 10 strength. So her hamstrings are hyper engaged, hyperactive. So that gives the perception that they feel tight because they're constantly contracted, trying to stabilize her back because her glutes are not working.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it's the most common thing when somebody has a knee injury or a back injury. Their quadriceps stop firing and their hamstrings tighten up, and that then causes the more perception of pain. Just a side note.
Okay.
All right. So what we've accomplished so far is that we need to have equal strength and equal flexibility. So what do we think are the most important things that we need to focus on as far as getting that equal strength and flexibility?
Oh boy.
Because there's all different types of stretching, right?
There are.
Is that going to be this podcast or the next one?
No, we can go on this one
Okay.
because I think that there are some things that we can talk about before we get into that stuff. And I think that that'll be a good part 2 to this because
Okay.
I was telling Jenny earlier, I could talk for hours on this subject. So ask that question again. And I want to answer that question directly because I think I have a pretty good example.
Okay. So what are the things that we need to focus on to obtain equal strength and equal flexibility?
Okay. The way that I like to explain it is you should have control of all the degrees of motion of your joint. So if we use your knee, for example, if it bends 100 degrees, hopefully it bends way more than 100 degrees, but for the purposes of this example, if it's 100 degrees flexible while you're passively stretching, you better have 100 degrees of active, meaning when you're activating the muscles. Does that make sense? Do I need to say it a little differently?
Well, I would, just for those who don't know what passive stretching and active stretching means, or passive strength and active strength.
So passive means you're just laying there stretching. You're relaxing, essentially. You can feel some tension, but you're relaxing. You're not actively trying to contract the muscle. You're just laying there and letting the tissues elongate or stretch. So that's passive. Versus active is you're contracting the muscle to be in a certain range. So if we go back to the knee, for example, when you're doing a quad stretch, so you're just standing there and you're trying to pull your heel up towards your butt.
Standing.
Okay. Or laying down, laying on your side, it doesn't matter. But let's just use standing, for example. In a standing position, trying to pull your heel up towards your butt to stretch the front of your leg out, a quad stretch. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it. Again, just for simplicity, let's say you have 100 degrees of knee flexion. You should have 140 or more if you're doing that stretch. But if for the simplicity, if you have 100 degrees of knee flexion, passively doing that stretch, you're just passively stretching, then you better be able to actively bend your knee 100 degrees. So in the standing position, trying to pull your heel up towards your butt, you better be able to pull it up 100 degrees if you're going to stretch it passively 100 degrees. Does that make sense? So we have equal strength throughout the entire range that you have available.
So if we can stand and put our heel to our bottom, so we have that, all of that motion, we should actively be able to get our heel to our bottom without pulling it?
Ideally, yes.
Oh, wow. That's, I
crazy.
think, challenging.
Crazy, isn't it?
Okay.
Here's the reason why it's important is because this all comes down to injury prevention. If you've got, think about a bicycle, the chain on a bicycle. When the chain on a bicycle is super loose, meaning you can see it hanging down lower than it should, you can see a loose bicycle chain. Everybody should be able to vision that. There is more flexibility than strength, meaning there's excessive motion in that chain, right?
Right.
And that's fine if you're just riding around real slow. But what happens if you start going down a hill?
The chain gets caught up.
Yeah, the chain comes off the sprocket. The chain comes off, right? Because there was too much mobility, too much flexibility for the speed that was being generated. The same exact thing is true in the human body, meaning that if you've got 100 degrees of range of motion in any joint, just for simplicity, but you've only got 90 degrees of strength, that's fine if you're just doing slow things, if you're just walking around, if you're just living a very slow, boring, dull life.
Jeez. Okay.
But the problem occurs when you have to do something really fast. You slip and you have to try to catch yourself. A baby is falling and you have to go run and jump for it.
The dog is tripping you.
The dog is tripping you.
And you pull your hammy.
Yeah. You're so funny. Oh, man.
But yes, I see where you're going with that now. So when you have quick movements where you can't consciously think about it as closely, you want the body to be able to move the way it's supposed to, and for the muscle to be able to stretch and activate at the same time like it's supposed to.
Yeah.
As opposed to having to consciously think, okay, activate and stretch to prevent an injury.
Correct.
I get it.
Yeah, so that's where it hits the fan, right? Mm-hmm. Is hypermobility or excessive flexibility in comparison to strength on the number scale is not a problem until it's a problem.
Right. I can see.
Does that help clarify?
Yes.
So do you want to do a couple of quick examples of when stretching is appropriate, and then we can continue this on to the next one and talk about all that other stuff we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think the next, part 2 should be the types of stretching, whether it's eccentric, dynamic, concentric. So we can talk about that in the next one.
So maybe we should pick up with what I just said on the next one then and just tie it all together.
Yeah, I think something we can talk about though is how do people know, other than injuries with things like slipping or catching the baby, how do they know if they don't have enough flexibility versus strength? I know one way for me personally is when I squat at the gym, I know my hip flexibility is not where it should be, because when I squat, I tend to be a little bit off as far as I'm not as level when it comes down to squatting. I can't get one side as low as the other. And the problem with that is, besides that it looks weird, is then I'm not activating one of my glutes, which then is going to lead to back pain, right? So that's my personal issue. But what about those who don't do significant weight lifting? Is the only way to know if they have this imbalance that they have pain like back pain or knee pain?
Great question. And I think that the answer is going to be the opposite of, because you started off saying, how do people know when they need to stretch?
Or when they need to strengthen more. Okay,
because that's what's more important here. The number one sign that you need to strengthen is feeling tightness after being in a position for a prolonged period of time.
Okay.
So the number one sign that you need to strengthen, not stretch, is when you feel tightness after being in a position for a prolonged period of time. For example, sitting's the new smoking, right? Sitting is the new epidemic that's sweeping America and all first world countries. There's more adverse side effects caused from sitting than there are smoking nowadays. So that's what that means. Sitting is the new smoking. So people sit for 2, 3, 4 hours and then stand up. A lot of those people will say, oh my God, my back feels so tight.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, the back feels tight when they stand up because the hip flexors are so tight.
Okay.
Because they've been sitting for a long period of time. So their hip flexors tighten up.
Right.
So the back feels tight, but the hip flexors are the ones that are actually causing the tightness in the back. But here's the kicker. One of the reasons why the hip flexors are so tight is not necessarily because you've been sitting for so long, but because when you came out of that seated position, you didn't squeeze your glutes hard enough, long enough to counteract the tightness in the front.
Okay.
So does that make sense? Your back feels tight because your hip flexors are tight, but your hip flexors are tight because your glutes were too weak. They didn't clench hard enough. You didn't squeeze them hard enough to take the tension away from the hip flexors that would take the tension away from the back.
Got it. So when they stand up, they don't need to go stretch their hips or stretch their back. They need to work on some little mini squats with their glutes activating.
Not even that much. So let's use this real life example. You just got done sitting for 3 hours. You're on a road trip. And usually every 3-4 hours, you got to stop for a restroom break or something. You get out of the car and your back feels so tight. The natural tendency that 9 out of 10 people do is they bend over to touch their toes to stretch out their low back. Mm-hmm. In reality, you should do almost the opposite. Instead of bending over to touch your toes, you should pull your belly button in and squeeze your glutes really hard.
Your butt cheeks.
Yeah. Your butt.
Mm-hmm. And that'll help release the tension that you're feeling in the back.
Correct.
Because it's not actually your back being tight.
Correct.
Got it.
It's your back. That perception of your back being tight is hyperactivity. Your back is tightening up actively to counteract the tightness in the front of the hip flexors due to weakness in the glutes.
Got it. So what we want to go into next is talking about some dynamic stretching tips, because stretching is important. We're not saying, this whole podcast wasn't to say that it's not important. It is important, but there's certain types of stretching that are actually going to help with activating the muscles at the same time, which will help to balance that strength to flexibility.
Correct. Rewind to the very beginning of this podcast. I said stretching's not good and stretching's not bad. Mm-hmm. It just depends. Mm-hmm. It really depends on what your body needs.
Got it.
Good?
Yeah. Cool.
All right. So catch us next week. We're going to get some real life examples. They're going to be a part 2 to this podcast because this is a very exciting, controversial topic. I love it. Mm-hmm. And until then, keep on keeping on. When you stand up out of that chair, pull your belly button in, squeeze your butt. Don't bend over to stretch out your back.
All right. Cool. Ciao for now.
See ya.
Thank you for subscribing on your social media and podcast platforms to the Berman Method. Dr. Jake Berman with Berman Physical Therapy and Jenny Berman, Physician Assistant with Berman Health and Wellness. You can find more information on our website, www.bermanpt.com for physical therapy, bermanpt.com/wellness for the health and wellness. You can also find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and on your podcast platform. So be sure to follow us, like us, subscribe to us. And if you would like any further information, definitely visit our website and reach out to us. You may also find our free reports on the websites as well, where you can download this free information for yourself. Have a great day.